Thank you very much, Maitri Nara, and it's very good to be in Brixton again. I think this is my third visit to the Brixton Sangha. Seems to be becoming a habit, a good habit. Good to have good habits, and I really enjoy coming here. I'm on a sort of a Buddhist tour at the moment. I gave a talk in Brighton last Wednesday, and I gave a talk at the LBC on Monday. And there's a few other things that I'll be doing at the London Buddhist Centre in Bethnal Green before I return to Padmavajra. And yes, it was explained to me that the series that you're sort of looking at, what did you call it?
The dazzling jewel qualities
dazzling
of
jewel
enlightenment.
qualities.
Yes.
Now that's quite a hard subject to live up to and to respond to, because you know one has to feel a bit dazzling and jewel-like to do it. I'm going to sort of start in another place, which was provoked by some reflections that were provoked by something I did earlier today. I actually went to jail. I went to Brixton jail. I went to prison. I went there for lunch. Some friends of mine who live near Brixton Prison had invited me for lunch, and they booked a meal at Clink, which is this really wonderful restaurant and charity which is in a number of jails throughout the country, where some of the inmates are training to be really top chefs and waiters and so on under professional management. And it was fantastic. It was a really, really lovely meal, beautiful food, and a very, very warm atmosphere. I mean, it was high security going in. I couldn't even take my hanky with me into it, and had to bring my passport and all the rest of it. But it was a really impressive setup actually, and we were able to talk to very easily to our waiter, who was a very, very positive, helpful young man. It was just his first day as a waiter as well, so I was very, very impressed by that. It got me thinking about prison, got me thinking about jail, and it got me thinking about a story from Buddhist tradition about people being in jail, being in prison. And it does relate to the dual qualities of enlightenment. We'll get there in the end, I assure you, but everybody loves a story. This is actually a very tragic story. It's the story of a king named Bimbisara, who was a disciple of the Buddha, and his queen, his wife, Vaidehi. And as often happened in those days, his Bimbisara's son, Ajatasattu, wanted to be the king, and he had his father arrested and incarcerated, and he decided to starve him to death. That was the best way to get rid of him, so that he could rule the land and become the great king of Magadha. Became a bit of a tyrant. He in turn, as time went on, was actually assassinated by his own son, so this is the way karma seems to work. But the weird thing was, Bimbisara wasn't dying. Even though he was jailed, he wasn't, and being starved to death, he showed no signs of dying. And this was because Vaidehi, his very faithful queen, seemed to have had a number of queens. Vaidehi was the oldest and the most faithful. She would go and see him every day, and before she went, she'd smear her whole body in grape juice and other nutritious substances, honey and so on, so she could go in to see him, and he could sustain himself by licking the unguents off of her body. It sounds bizarre, doesn't it? So this was discovered, and Ajatasattu was so angry. He tried to kill his mother, and he was restrained by his advisors and courtiers, and said, well, even this is too much. And she was incarcerated, and Bimbisara died, Vaidehi's in jail, she's in a very, very bad place. And what a family, what a situation. But Vaidehi, like her husband, was a very, very faithful disciple of the Buddha, and she knew that the Buddha would be teaching not that far from the great city of Rajagriha, on a great mountain called the Vulture's Peak, the Grudrakuta. He'd be there with his disciples teaching the Dharma, and she entreated. There's tremendous longing entreaty, asking him to come, somehow to come, and to give comfort and to give teaching, to give blessing. This, out of this tremendous longing, somehow or other, there's this great vision that appears to her of the Buddha and his disciples, and she has a dialogue. She says, "Show me another world. This world is so terrible. This world, this life is so terrible. Show me a better world. Show me a better world where I can go. That is, where there isn't this, horror that I'm experiencing." And the Buddha then proceeds to teach her a meditation, a quite elaborate meditation. It's a meditation, the meditation on another Buddha in the far western direction, an archetypal Buddha, we might say, a visionary Buddha named Amitābha, the Buddha of eternal life, the transcendence of life. And he proceeded to describe a very elaborate meditation of the world in which this Buddha presided, in which this Buddha teaches, a world without any suffering, a world without any pain, a world without any of this terrible conflict and violence, a world where it is free, a world that doesn't have any incarceration, and where all you need to do is open to the influence of the Buddha. So this is a very, very important, very, very famous Buddhist text, and I'm not going to go into all of the meditations that the Buddha teaches Vaidehi. I just want to make a few reflections and then say more about the figure of Amitābha, who's also known as Amitābha, the Buddha of infinite light. And I'm going to mainly talk about Amitābha in this talk. The thing that's really striking at first is this symbolism of the jail, the symbolism of imprisonment. I mean, these stories, you can take them on all sorts of levels. When you read a Buddhist text, there's the sort of ordinary meaning, as it were, but there's also a highly symbolic and universal meaning. And of course, the jail, imprisonment, incarceration, is a symbol for what Buddhist tradition calls the samsara, the world of conditioned existence, the wheel of life. The wheel of life is sometimes described as, there are texts which describe our existence as, we don't know it, and out of ignorance we do things to one another, unhelpful things, unkindly things to ourselves and others, and we are like, although we don't know it, like prisoners, unable to escape from a jail, revolving in the samsara. It might not be your experience, it might not be the way you would look at your life, but sometimes we can have those moments when we feel really trapped. We feel really trapped, we feel really constricted. It might even be that our life is quite good. We haven't been involved in, the kind of conflict that was going on with, Ajatasattu and his father and his wife, that kind of violence, that kind of terror. Although sometimes people can fall into that. But we might feel that, hang on a minute, life is okay. I'm earning enough money, I have a roof over my head, my family's okay, everything is as it should be. But it is incomplete. I'm incomplete, and I feel incarcerated. I feel restricted, limited. There's a wonderful teaching of the Buddha which describes his experience before he left his home life, the extended, very imprisoning, stifling family life of minor Indian aristocracy. His language is very, very, very beautiful, and I think very poignant, and I think we can relate to it. He says, "Cramped is this life at home, dusty indeed its sphere, open the going forth. When you go forth, you live out in the open, under the sky." I mean, again, you can take that, in his case that was literal, but you can also take it metaphorically. Sometimes we feel that we're really cramped and restricted, particularly by our own habits, by our own reactions and our own responses. There can be this sort of feeling that our heart, our mind, our heart, our being is somehow or other restricted and closed, and we sense that there is a different life. Might not literally result in leaving home or something like that, leaving our loved ones and so on, but we sense there is another life, an open life, a life where we're not restricted by our habitual responses to things, where we can live differently. This is the sort of, in a way, the beginnings of a genuinely Buddhist life, or a genuine spiritual life, when we start to sort of notice that we're a bit cramped, we're a bit imprisoned, somewhat imprisoned, and we long for that something higher. We even start searching for that wider, more open, more liberated dimension of things. So in a way, this is what's going on with the story of Vaidehi, dramatic though it is, and terrible though it is that actually has universal significance. We start to long for something else, something beyond what we know, beyond what we experience. We might call it something higher or something greater or something like that. This, in Buddhist tradition, is described, this initial experience is described as the awakening of faith, the awakening of Shraddha. Shraddha is usually translated as faith, but it's very, very hard to translate it into English. It's not faith in the sense of blind belief, but it's more like the sort of trembling, if you like, that sort of sense of trembling, vibrating in the core of yourself for something beyond what you know. There's this sense that you intuit and you long for something that is more than yourself, as Rilke describes it in one of his Duino elegies, something more than yourself as you know yourself now. It's a very, very important experience. Very important, I think, to cherish those experiences. Sometimes these experiences can be very inconvenient. We should just acknowledge that. Extremely inconvenient. You have this, life is going along okay or not, but then you have this sense there is something beyond. What's being delivered at the moment is really not enough. It's not satisfactory. It's not good enough. It's not great enough. It's not true enough. And that can really be inconvenient, because you start having to change the way you look at things. And, friends, loved ones, family can sometimes find you a pain when you start going on that journey, because you're making it inconvenient for them, because you don't want to go to the pub anymore. You don't want to watch, the latest box set anymore. You don't want to do those things. You want to start learning to meditate. You start reading weird books about Buddhism or meditation or something like that. You even start going to a Buddhist meditation class and mixing with these Buddhist people, and even start wanting to do that more and more, which can be very, very inconvenient for everybody. But you have to respond. There's a sort of, even though it's inconvenient, you feel that you have to respond, and you start getting a greater vision of what is possible, a greater vision of what might be, what you could be, what the world could be indeed. And this is where this vision of what is possible, this is where the dazzling jewel
qualities.
The dazzling jewel qualities of enlightenment sort of comes in. The word enlightenment is a very boring word, isn't it, really? That the dazzling jewel qualities isn't boring, but the word enlightenment itself isn't particularly exciting. Of course, it's a translation of the Sanskrit bodhi, which means awakening or enlightenment, waking up from the sleep of ignorance, and it's related to the word Buddha, which is the being, the person who has woken up from the sleep of ignorance. And you might well have heard the story of the life of the Buddha, the person, the man who changed his life completely into the state of supreme and perfect enlightenment. But what you might not have come across so often if you haven't been around Buddhism for very long is that as Buddhism develops in Asia, not only is the historical Buddha of great importance, there emerges a whole sort of range of Buddhas, if you like. All sorts of figures start to emerge. They look like the Buddha, they are seated in meditation in that typical way. They've got the little bump on their head and so on and so forth, but they have different names, different colours. They even start to sit at the centre of a whole web of symbolism, a whole array of symbols and connections. Some, Western scholars, even some sectarian Buddhists, regard the emergence of these figures as a sort of falling away from the kind of pristine, very simple Buddhism of the Buddha and his early disciples. But that would be, I think, a mistake. My own teacher, Sangharakshita, our teacher, the founder of our movement, feels that one of the things that's going on with the emergence of all this plethora of forms and images and even mythologies that start to develop is all emerging out of a great sense of longing, to be in contact directly with the state of enlightenment. It's a very interesting way of thinking about it. I don't know if you've ever wondered what it might have been like for the early Buddhists, the actual direct disciples of the Buddha, when the Buddha died or entered what we call parinibbana, final nirvana. The effect, unless you were an enlightened disciple, if you're an enlightened disciple in a way there's no change because you're always in touch with enlightenment, so there's no sense of loss. Not that you're indifferent or cold, but you don't associate, if you like, the Buddha with any particular form. Enlightenment is a constant presence for you. But for people like ourselves, or certainly people like me, the loss of the Buddha is the loss of the presence of enlightenment, the living presence of wisdom and compassion and instruction and example and exemplification and mystery and presence and depth and profundity. There's that tremendous sort of sense that light has gone out of the world. It's a very, very powerful feeling and emotion. And of course, sometimes, when you read the descriptions of people being very upset about this, the tendency when we read these things is not to identify with those people. We identify with the calm, equanimous, enlightened disciples. But that's not where we are. We're much more like those people who feel a tremendous sense of loss at the departure of their teacher. And some of us have had this experience recently in our own order with the loss of our own teacher. Sangharakshita died some months ago, and I, as Maitri Nara said, I first met him when I was 17. He was my direct teacher. He ordained me, he named me, he taught me personally. And whilst I feel, in a sense, no sense of loss, because he's taught me everything I need now to go on, from another point of view, I feel a tremendous sense of loss, because I can't go and see that man who I feel the deepest reverence for. That's not possible. That's not available to me. And of course, what that opens up, and what it opened up for the disciples of the Buddha, is this tremendous longing. Longing is a very, very interesting emotion. We can often associate it with quite negative emotions, as when we're desperately in love with somebody but it's not reciprocated, and we have that awful sort of depressive longing, because we can't be with that person. This isn't that kind of longing. This longing is something else. It's the recognition of the absence of enlightenment, the recognition that enlightenment is not present. And when you recognise that, weirdly, that's the beginning of making real contact. When you know that something is absent, really know it. When you know that you don't know. When you know that you are not as developed as you think you are. When you know that, then a tremendous longing starts to open up to discover, to see, to appreciate, to have direct contact. So all of the imagery that develops in Buddhist tradition, which is extraordinarily rich, it's extraordinarily rich in imagery, in metaphor, in symbolism, in mythology, is in a sense this great expression of longing. Everything is the expression of that. To make connection with the presence of enlightenment. It's sometimes said, it has been said by one particular very, very great scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, particular aspect of Tibetan Buddhism, a Buddhist practitioner named Janet Gyatso. She says that Tibetan culture is a culture of longing. An amazing idea that Tibetan religious culture is a culture of longing. Longing for being in contact with the first, one of the great founders of Tibetan Buddhism, this figure named Padmavajra, a great teacher, because he had a huge impact on the Tibetan people and on Tibetan culture, and then he left. And so there's this culture of longing, of wanting to be connected now, in the present, through the illumined imagination, through vision, through transforming your life from that longing. I think sometimes we need to pay much more attention to our longings, much more attention to them. What are we whoever or whatever we long for, what are we really longing for? What would really deeply satisfy us? So I want to talk about one figure that emerges out of this longing, out of this expression of longing. I want to talk about the figure of Amitābha, who is related to this figure Amitābha, particularly Amitābha as he appears in later Buddhism called Tantric Buddhism. And in this tradition, Amitābha is a Buddha figure like that, but his hands are in the dhyana mudra, the mudra of meditation. And he is deep red in colour, ruby red in colour, this very, very deep, luminous red. He's seated with his eyes half closed on a great red lotus throne, a lotus throne moreover supported by peacocks, if you can imagine such a thing, with their beautiful plumage. So he's this great red meditating Buddha on a great red lotus supported by a peacock throne. So I want to, as it were, meditate on this symbolism a little bit. And The thing is about Tantric Buddhism, Tantra means, can be translated as thread, a thread as in a tapestry. And some people say that the meaning of this is because what Tantric Buddhism is particularly concerned with is the continuity between ourselves now, what you might call our ordinary everyday existence, and enlightenment itself. They're very, very interested in seeing enlightenment as a concrete reality in our experience now, as well as having this incredible sort of visionary dimension. So that we have this great, very exotic sounding figure, isn't he? This great red Buddha dressed in wonderful red robes, embroidered with gold, seated on a great red lotus on a throne of peacocks. And yet there is a continuity between that figure of enlightenment that is expressive of the qualities of enlightenment and us now. And that's important because that continuity shows us how we might go on the path of transformation to become even that figure, that enlightened figure. So I want to dwell on that a little bit. The first thing, of course, that's really striking with this figure is the red colour, the rich ruby red colour. You know, what Tantric Buddhists would probably say, that wherever there is red, there is Amitābha. Wherever you see red, whatever it might be the most mundane thing, a red cushion, or I don't know, wherever you're looking at red, there you are, fire alarm. Amitābha's there. Have something to say about fire in a minute. Amitābha is there. You're reminded of this quality of enlightenment. And red is a very interesting colour. I mean, it's my favourite colour, although interestingly I never wear red. I can't wear red. It's too you stand out too much when you wear red, don't you? But it's really is my favourite colour. And I remember I went to see Sangharakshita once to talk about taking up another meditation practice, which involved visualising a red goddess type figure, and he was more interested in the fact of the colour red. He said, "Well, red that's a very important colour," and yes, red. He just kept going on saying the word red repeatedly, as if to say that's the really important thing. Red, as if everything was in red. That if you visualised red, you'd discover what it was that you were searching for. And he said apparently it's the first colour that a baby recognises, I suppose because it's so dramatic, isn't it? And of course it's the colour of blood, it's the colour of life in that sense, the precious life blood. This is all related to enlightenment in some mysterious way. Tantric Buddhism is very hermetic. As above, so below, as below, so above. There's a continuity between our mundane experience and reality itself. And of course, as well as life, it's very, very much the colour of passion, isn't it? You know, we talk about a red-blooded person, don't we? He or she are very red-blooded. They're very, very passionate, and so it has this connotation of passion. And in the case of Amitābha, it's sometimes, and of course passion generally in Buddhist tradition is seen as a problematic emotion, you know, because you're going to lose all mindfulness and all sense and throw yourself into something that could be, or is bound to be, kind of catastrophic. You know, you're sort of impetuous. I mean, for some reason people often describe me as a passionate person. I find that I don't find that a very reassuring thing, because in my experience passion gets me into a lot of trouble because I usually behave rather impetuously and then have to clear up the mess afterwards. It's getting better as I get older, thankfully. But in Tantric Buddhism they take things like this, the kind of emotions that can often lead us into temptation. Where did that come from? And they say, well, no, there is another kind of passion. there is the great passion, Maharaga, the great passion. Passion itself, when you gain enlightenment, when you have the liberating vision of the emptiness of all things, when you see through all self-clinging or distinction between self and other, it becomes this great passion. It's passion for everybody, not just one person. In other words, it's the great love and the great compassion, the great feeling with others, the great sensitivity to all life. This is what we're heading for in the Padmavajra meditation. What the Padmavajra meditation is leading to is this all-embracing passion, love and compassion for all life, which is of course one of the great qualities of enlightenment itself. And associated with this, Amitābha has a particular quality of wisdom. Every Buddha, of course, is wise, but Amitābha has a special kind of wisdom. It's often described as a discriminating wisdom, the wisdom that sees the differences. It's not a very good translation. It's much better to translate it from the original Sanskrit as the wisdom of particularity, the wisdom of particularity, or the wisdom of singularity, if you like. What Amitābha's love sees is the distinct and unique qualities of absolutely everything and everybody. Yes, he has this all-embracing love that loves everybody without discrimination, but he also sees the particular. And this is very, very important because we are all highly individual, highly particular. And this is, this wisdom of particularity means that the enlightened person, in enlightenment itself, the teaching is going to be really tuned up for everybody. Yes, it's general, it's for everybody, but it's going to be particularly delivered to each and every individual. You see this with the Buddha himself, with his teaching. Yes, he can give general teachings which will affect everybody, but everybody feels that he's talking to them in particular, personally, directly to their own heart, speaking the words that they really need to hear. And it's weird because this is what passion is like. You can sort of see it. Do you remember those, I don't know if you remember, or it might even be going on for you now, but you remember those times when you were in love with someone really intensely? I don't mean just a sort of passing infatuation, but I mean really in love with somebody. It's been a long time for me. But you can't see it in the moment, but when I look back on those times, when I was really in love with somebody, I become very, I love everything about that person. Everything, the way they walk, the way they talk, the way their hair is, their eyes are, the way they move, everything is heightened. That's what love does, isn't it? Everything is heightened for you. Well, imagine a situation in enlightenment where actually you see everybody like that. Everybody is heightened. Everybody is special. Everybody is particular. And of course we can start to practice that right now. We don't have to wait for enlightenment. We can actually start now by giving our attention very, very fully, very, very completely to whoever we're with. Yes, we've got to take into account everybody we're with. But, when we're with somebody, we can give them our full attention. Really give them out, really listen, really tune into them, really take them in. That's a step on the path, a very significant step on the path if we can start to do that. So that all comes out of a sort of meditation, if you like, on the red colour of the Buddha, Amitābha. It's this quality of love, it's this quality of special, particular attention. It tells us that we can even transmute even quite difficult, disturbing, even ensnaring emotions and take them onto the path. And This is why Amitābha is supported by peacocks. In Indian tradition, peacocks are very, very special birds because apparently they live on snakes, poisonous snakes. Their favourite food. I don't know if this is actually true in real life and on natural world programs, natural history programs. But according to Indian tradition, peacocks absolutely love the taste and nutrition from highly poisonous snakes. But of course they have the wonderful plumage. And what the tantric people say is that, well, you feed on the poison and you transmute it into this wonderful display of the beauty of enlightenment. So I think we can see how this might work through that little reflection on passion, love, and how that might be transmuted into the great passion, the great love, and giving a quality of attention to everybody that we come across, to everybody that we meet. That's real mindfulness. Mindfulness, of course, is one of the buzzwords of the moment, but very often people don't talk about mindfulness in relation to others. Mindfulness of others is one of the great practices. It's the practice, really being tuned up in relation to everybody that you meet. So that's something on Amitābha and the colour red. He's also associated with an element in Indian tradition. There are as there is in other traditions, there are the great elements of earth, water, fire, air and space. And Amitābha, for obvious reasons, is associated with fire. He's associated with heat and flame, and this is a very, very interesting symbolism. Sometimes the Buddha himself, in his own teaching, described the Buddhist life as making heat. Tapasya, it's an old word, making heat, tapasya. It's an old word for severe asceticism, but the Buddha took it up and gave it a different meaning and said, when you practice Buddhism, when you practice the Dharma, especially when you meditate, you're generating heat. You're generating spiritual heat. Sometimes you can even find, when you're meditating, even on a cold day, that suddenly you're really warming up. You're really generating something. You can feel it sort of physically as you meditate, as you become more mindful, more concentrated, as you start to transform the sort of baser emotions in you. There's a kind of burning. There's a kind of burning up. The Buddha gets very homely about this. There's a teaching in which he says that what we're really like when we're meditating, we're like hens. All of us are like hens. Hens sitting on the eggs, making heat so that the eggs will hatch. In other words, when we meditate, we're giving birth to ourselves, if you like. We're giving birth to a new kind of self. A transformation is happening. And you can, if you meditate regularly, a few weeks, a few months, every day. When I say regularly, I mean every day, maybe even twice a day. If you go on a retreat, you can start to feel this. You can start to feel that a new person is emerging, is hatching out of the egg. So there's this idea that in Buddhism that Buddhist practice leads to a rebirth, a spiritual rebirth, that our old self, if you like, starts to die away and something new starts to emerge. Sometimes this can even be quite a painful process. There's another emotion that Amitābha is associated with. Every Buddhist figure has a mantra, a sound syllable as it's called, associated with them. So Amitābha's mantra is Om Amideva Hri. Om Amideva Hri. Amideva meaning the infinitely shining one. Om Amideva Hri. And the word Hri, which is said to be his heart mantra, invokes the very heart of this figure. The word Hri is a very interesting one because it's a word that also means, this is a very positive thing, positive ethical shame. Positive ethical shame. It's very hard to put it into English. It's not irrational guilt, just feeling bad about yourself because you feel you've done something bad, but you don't know what it is. You've just been taught to feel that way. Shame is in this sense, is much more conscious. It's more that you have a direct and an immediate knowing, even as it were tasting, that you have gone against your ethical values. There you are doing the loving kindness meditation regularly, and you lose it with somebody at work or in the family. Well, if you're really practicing that loving kindness meditation, you'll feel a burning, a shame. You'll feel free. And it's really interesting that that this is in Amitābha's mantra. There's something, a great German Buddhist writer, a Buddhist named Lama Anagarika Govinda, wrote a very wonderful piece on this word Hri, and he says that feeling of Hri actually comes from a root meaning to blush. You know, when we do something unskillful, as we call it, and we directly recognise it, we blush. He says, actually, even though that's painful, even though you feel you've gone against what you most cherish and value, that's actually the rising up of enlightenment. It's the rising up of Amitābha in that very experience. So even in the moment of moral failure, if you like, if you see that and know that with your heart directly, there's the rising up, if you like, of that felt sense and connection with enlightenment itself. So, and it's very interesting to talk like this because it's clear that in Buddhism, ethics is a sensibility. Yes, we have ethical precepts in Buddhism, but when you practice your ethical precepts, you're looking to develop a direct ethical sense, almost like an aesthetic sense. If you like, you start to become very sensitive to the unbeautiful in your behaviour. It's not that, goodness, if you like, in Buddhism is related very strongly to beauty. You start to see, no, this is so unbecoming, this is so unpleasing. It's ugly, actually, the way I'm thinking, the way I'm talking, the way I'm treating people. And also you start to notice, no, this is a beautiful act, what I'm doing. There's a kind of symmetry to it, a rightness to it. I mean, do you ever notice when you see somebody behaving very, very nobly, maybe in a drama or a film or something like that, or even in everyday life, when somebody does something genuinely selfless, even if somebody very, very nobly and honestly acknowledges their failing heroically, you don't say, oh, well, very good moral act, well done. You actually feel moved, even moved to tears. There's a rightness about it, an aesthetic to it. It's that, if you like, the world is set aright again. So even in the act of shame, if you like, the experience of shame, ethical sensibility, there's the rising up of Amitābha, there's the rising up of enlightenment itself. So I've been trying, to evoke, through these reflections, the sort of connection that we have with the radiant jewel-like qualities of enlightenment through just meditating on this form of Amitābha, trying to get a sort of feeling for that and how that might manifest in our daily life, how that might manifest in quite ordinary things that we see around us, ordinary behaviours that we experience. So the point that's coming across here is that liberation from the prison of samsara, as we might call it, is right with us. It's right in the jail, if you like. It's right here with us. The answer, if you like, to the sort of issues that we might have is right in front of us. This is what the teaching of Amitābha in the tantric context is getting across to us. Of course, as you go on in your practice, what starts to happen is that you start to, as your love develops, as your practice develops, of course you start to connect with others who are also practicing like that. So in other words, Sangha, spiritual friendship, starts to grow, as we call it. And Amitābha is very, very much the Buddha of friendship. When we start to really befriend other people very cleanly, if you like, very open-handedly, open-heartedly, without expectation, which is what we're trying to do within what we call the Buddhist spiritual community, we're actually bringing Amitābha more fully into the world, because Amitābha traditionally presides over a whole world. It's called a pure Buddha field, sometimes just called the pure land. And it's a vision, if you like, of life, a world completely transformed, a world which is completely conducive to Buddhist practice. It's a very, very important vision in Buddhist tradition. This whole idea, in other words, that Buddhist life is not just simply for ourselves, it's for the benefit of all, it's for the benefit of everybody. And we need to start creating, or being involved in creating, environments in which people can find it easy to grow along the path. This is called the Lotus Paradise sometimes, the Sakhavati, the world of bliss, because everybody sits on lotuses and just listens to the Buddha teaching and just opens up to the Buddha's influence, the Lotus Paradise. But it sounds like a dream, it sounds like a sort of fairy story, a fantasy that, you know, and sometimes where in its more popular manifestations, it's something you just pray for after death. But actually, we need to bring it into the here and now. In our own Buddhist order, we have this very strong vision, that our teacher transmitted, that what we're really trying to do is not just do a bit of meditation, do a bit of personal development. We're actually trying to come together as a community to create something like a Buddha field, something like an environment where as soon as people come into it, they begin to feel uplifted, they begin to feel a sense of freedom, they begin to feel a sense of openness. And of course, you know, you do need places like this in which you can come together. But a place like this would be useless if there wasn't a culture of friendship and love between people. That's so crucial, that sense of love and friendship. I've been reflecting quite a bit on love and friendship recently, from not so much from a Buddhist source, but from a Christian source, amazingly. There's this great British English Cistercian monk named Aelred of Rievaulx, a Yorkshire Cistercian monk of the Middle Ages, High Middle Ages, who has an extraordinary vision of love and friendship. In one of his discourses, he puts into the mouth of one of the people he's dialoguing with, so are you saying friendship is God? Astonishing thing to say. Friendship is God. Well, we don't have God in that sense in Buddhism, but I think we would say friendship is enlightenment. I would say that. Friendship is enlightenment. Enlightenment is friendship, because real friendship, and maybe we don't even the word friendship isn't enough, but real friendship means stepping into a connection with somebody where you start to transcend the difference between self and other. When you start to transcend those differences, yes, everybody is uniquely, distinctly, beautifully, wonderfully, quirkily themselves, and yet we are profoundly interconnected, and that interconnection is expressed through friendship, through metta, through love. And friendship is to be expressed. So again, something I've been reflecting a bit on recently is the need for expression. The jewel-like qualities of enlightenment are expressed. from a certain point of view, these figures like Amitābha, who I've just talked about, tried to evoke, certain traditions say they are the expressions, the abundance of reality. Certain Buddhist texts say that reality is constantly expressing in the most beautiful of forms, constantly expressing itself so that you can tune into it, so it can be available to you, that liberating vision of reality. So it's expressive. It's really important that we express friendship, love, generosity. These emotions need to be expressed. If they don't get expressed, they die. They wither. You'll see it sometimes with people who become very, very cynical. It's very often their cynicism is to do with the fact that they've never expressed, or they've forgotten to express. And of course, expression is quite a risky thing. You have to sort of step out beyond what you're comfortable with to tell someone very cleanly, without wanting anything back, how much you love them, how much you value them, how much you appreciate them. So the spiritual community, the Sangha as we call it, the community of friendship, if it really is a spiritual community, must have this constant sense, this constant expression, mutual expression of love, affection, appreciation. Sangharakshita, our teacher, said the spiritual community is characterized by the constant exchange of presence, whether material presence or just the presence of expressing appreciation and kindness and helpfulness. And not always, it's not a question of waiting for when somebody's in difficulty. Of course, that is a time to really express your love for someone. It also needs to be just because you want to, just because you see their beauty and their uniqueness and their qualities. There's something valuable about that in itself, in doing that. So if we want to bring Amitābha and this pure Buddha field into existence, yes, even here in Brixton, even in South London, that's the way we do it. Full and complete expression of our love and appreciation for one another. Love and appreciation for the fact of our precious human existence. Somebody was asking me yesterday, well, what's the point of gaining enlightenment? I mean, why bother? Why not just get on? It's a good question, actually. Why do you do all this Buddhist stuff? And of course, what the real Buddhist answer to that is, you can give sort of elaborate explanations. It's because there's something deep in human life, essential to human life, that wants to express the finest, the highest, the greatest possible qualities. It's not a luxury item. It's not something that let's sort out the world first, and Brexit and climate change and all the rest of it, and we'll do all that later. You can't do that. You've got to do it now, immediately. Give expression to the deepest, the finest in you, and then start to transcend yourself. In other words, as the great Zen master Harkwin says, we need to wake up to the fact that we need to make this very place, the Lotus Paradise of Amitābha, this very body, the Buddha. There we are.